Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Neil Kiernan. Did I say that correctly?
Kiernan, yeah.
Kiernan. And he runs V Radio, and he has a YouTube channel where he uploads content from V Radio. He recently interviewed Derek Jensen, and when I recently had Derek Jensen on for a discussion about the left going crazy, one thing led to another, and he found my channel in that episode, and we've sort of been DMing each other, and I thought, yeah, let's have him on. Let's talk about this. So why don't you give a little bit of a background explanation of who you are and what you're currently doing right now?
Well, I started being involved in activist journalism back in 2008. I've kind of gone through the gambit of different perspectives as far as activism, as far as political beliefs, as far as, every aspect of that. My show nowadays is a little different, and I tell people because, you can still listen to my archives all the way back from 2008. I don't necessarily agree with everything I did before. But what really, because I had taken a long break, and the long break was because my kids wanted to get involved in sports. My father was not very supportive when I wanted to be involved in sports, so I was going to be the better dad. And so I took actually a few years of a break. My podcast at one time had about 400,000 listeners worldwide, and I'm trying to more slowly rebuild my audience, but I'm trying to stay out of being monetarily motivated as long as possible, because I kind of found that that does things to your integrity, whether you want it to or not, because you have to make certain decisions about whether or not you're going to keep certain audience members or whatever. But the big motive that got me started, ironically, was, aside from the fact that people were saying things during the 2020 election that I knew were untrue, because I used to work for Senator Mike Gravel when he ran in 2008, there was also just, I kind of just noticed that people's ability to talk about things objectively in a constructive fashion was breaking down, literally just falling apart. And I think one of the quintessential moments in particular was when I watched the Kyle Rittenhouse incident unfold. And, what happened with that was that I noticed that there were a lot of people saying stuff that just didn't happen. It wasn't sort of true, wasn't true from a certain perspective. No, literally, people are just lying about what was going on. And I spent 2 weeks literally hurting myself from being in my chair too much, because I have spinal injuries, putting together this documentary. And my video editing is nowhere near as good as my podcasting, but it was really the only way to make the argument I wanted to make about what really took place. And I was astonished to see how resistant to the facts people really were regarding that issue. I was astonished at the fact that you could just show them evidence, and you would generally, what would happen is, if they would try to pick apart any source you give them. Everybody does that, and I advise that, some people should, but at the same time, they would just eventually just kind of get to a point where it's all about, well, the real problem here is you're racist, or you're fascist, or you're white supremacist. It's not that you just showed me a video that proved that everybody that, that he shot at, attacked him first. It has to be about all these, personal flaws you have, and all of that has been true to some extent throughout, the history of politics. But I've found that it's really getting out of control now, because there are things that people can be shown demonstrably to be false, and we're so polarized. This is the analogy I typically use when I'm describing this when people interview me is, imagine when you're a kid and you're in gym class. So you're not necessarily very mature, and winning is really important to you. And the gym teacher, calls a point, for your team, and the ball was out, but you don't say anything, and your friends don't say anything, because you want your team to win. And that's when I realized politics is really headed in that direction, way over the top, more than normal. And that's the reason why, for example, Kyle Rittenhouse absolutely must be guilty of murder, because he's not on our side. And when, in a similar vein, I also very closely studied when Michael Reinhold, Mr. I'm 100% Antifa, walked up and gangland executed a guy in downtown Portland. And then everybody tried to make that into self-defense, rather ironically, in the other direction. And all of my video analysis of that came to the very clear conclusion that no, that's not what happened. He stalked the guy, well, walked up behind him and then got to the front of him and then shot him. But they have their own versions of it. And another excellent example of the false news about that was that Vox and some of the more heavily left biased media picked up one witness who said that when the police went to apprehend him, they just gunned him down. When there are two other witnesses that said no, he pulled a rifle out of his car and tried to kill them, and so they killed him. But they don't talk about the other two witnesses. They only talk about the one that pushes the narrative that they want. So you couple all of this with one of their major motivating factor was just the rise of the wokeness, which was a problem for a while. And I'm actually just starting to learn just how long it's been a problem. But when I was at Occupy Detroit and Occupy Flint, it was an interesting situation because I was at two different camps. Not everybody did that. A lot of people just kind of picked a camp and stayed at one. And what I noticed was a very distinct difference. Occupy Detroit at some point became heavily infected with like wokeness, social justice, inquisition thinking. And I don't describe it as an inquisition to be hyperbolic in any way, because I studied religious persecution when I was younger, and it has all of the same like basic irrational facets to it, the same mechanisms as an inquisition that leads witch hunts to find heretics for excommunication. And that's only if they can't just find you somewhere and beat you up at a protest. And basically what I noticed was that in Occupy Detroit, this stuff just took over everything. And then just it became the focus of every meeting. It became the focus of every talk. Like have the white males talked too much about this topic? At one point, Occupy Detroit made it this big accomplishment that they passed some kind of resolution that no white males would be allowed to speak on behalf of Occupy Detroit. And that was when check your privilege was extremely, popular. If you're losing an argument, you happen to be someone in the accepted, oppressed class, then just simply say that the person is more privileged than you and therefore they should stop arguing and just let them win. As opposed to Occupy Flint, and now I want to be clear, Occupy Flint had its own problems, but they were not in any way oriented because of this. So for example, at Occupy Flint, we had like really high quality straw structures reinforced with tarps. We had we had solar power. We had so many amenities. It was a much more comfortable place to be and much more productive because we weren't spending all of our time analyzing the colors, races, sexes, genders of everybody present to determine a new hierarchy based upon who is the most oppressed is therefore at the top of the hierarchy. And they don't want to say it that way. They claim that it's about equality, but it becomes pretty clear, when you talk to these people. And, one more thing I would say that is important is that the anarchist movements moved in really heavy. That's why when people try to say that Antifa doesn't exist right now, I just roll my eyes because I'm like, no, we dealt with them in Occupy. That was like years ago. And the funny thing is, if you look at blog articles from that time period, everybody talked about Antifa, that it was, it was a decentralized group of organizations. They do communicate with each other, but there's none of this nonsense that they don't exist. There was an understanding that this is a primarily anarchist communist group, and they openly admitted it. They didn't hide it at all. And you can still find interviews where they're talking to Antifa who are openly talking about that. Nowadays, there seems to be this interesting fiction that people are trying to push that they don't exist. And nobody who was a leftist at that time believes that. That's just bullshit. And to prove that, I posted a news link in one of my videos where you're literally just looking at Black Bloc Antifa doing exactly what they're doing now. And if I didn't tell them, by the way, this is a video from Occupy, you would assume you were looking at Antifa doing what they do at Black Lives Matter protests today. So to claim that it's, it's a new thing, or rather that it's just an idea, I had always kind of suspected that there was a joke going on about that. So I got onto some of their private forums and they just openly admit that it's an attempt to try to draw people in. We're going to tell everybody, if you don't like fascism, then you're one of us. And then we'll slowly expose them to more and more radical ideas. I was like, oh, well, yeah, that's what I thought you guys were doing. If they basically they have a different face if they don't think certain people are looking, which is also why they're kind of trying to crack down on people videotaping them now, because it's not working out for them. But as far as my show, one of the things that I would say is different now is that I do some stuff that has led to me getting fans that are from the right. And it's because of the fact that, as Derek and I talked about when brought him on, is that the left is lying so much right now that it's difficult for me to have communications about the legitimate concerns I have about, say, Donald Trump or right policies, because they've been so overexposed to lies that at that point, I have to gain credibility with people on the right to even have a political conversation with them that's going to in any way be productive, because they've just completely abandoned any need for that. And the new leftist strategy is, instead of trying to break things down and understand them critically and logically, if it's instead to just intimidate anybody who doesn't agree with you into silence. And what they don't realize is, like, actually kind of what was proven in 2016 when they did that during the election, is that doesn't actually get anybody to agree with you. They just don't talk to you anymore. And then when they get in the voting booth, or in some situation where you're not present, all of a sudden, all of your efforts to yell and scream and slur people, get to nowhere. And the only thing that the violence is doing right now, and this is another aspect I would say from the history standpoint, is in 2008, we were concerned about the Patriot Act. We were concerned that all activism would get labeled domestic terrorism. And now it honestly looks to me and to several of my, people that I work with, colleagues and such, that it's almost as if Antifa is trying to get leftist ideology labeled domestic terrorist. Eventually, that seems to be the goal, because then they can crack down on us. Then it can just even having a reasonable leftist conversation can get you associated with, a lot of negative things that people on the left don't necessarily agree with. And it already happens. I've got to defend myself against Stalinist and Maoist ideas that I don't even hold. So anyway, I've talked for a while, so go ahead.
Well, yeah, I have one question for you. I think in light of the hardening of these political lines and the fact that, as you've pointed out, the left, it was just willing to lie and fabricate facts, to what extent do you think that's going to cause people on the right who would be otherwise more open-minded to just side with their side no matter what, because it's either that and putting up with the shady business, or, getting beaten up by a bunch of Antifa fanatics because they're never going to hear your side of the story. You're guilty because of your uniform, your white skin, or your male genitalia.
No, that already happens for sure. And it also does this weird thing of where people think that they have to leave the left, and I'm like, okay, so wait a second. You mean you've moved to the right because you don't like wokeism? I'm like, okay, so did that suddenly change your attitude about healthcare or childcare? It's like, that doesn't make any sense. But people have basically been kind of coerced into thinking that that's what they have to do, because this is another element of something I've been pointing out for many years, and the reason I've always been an independent. It seems that our politics are packaged. Like, you're expected to follow your package. So, for example, I'm pro-gun rights. So if I start talking about gun rights, people will say, you Republicans, because they assume that because I'm pro-gun rights, that must also mean that I am all these other things. But I'm also pro-welfare. So where do I fit? I don't actually fit in either of those places. But you're being conditioned to believe that if you follow these, that one element of this package, you have to follow all of it, even though gun rights and welfare really have nothing to do with each other. I do believe that it's the polarization effect is creating a situation where we are getting less and less and less capable of talking to each other. The only thing that I would say that's beneficial is that I am discovering, however, that both on the right and the left, there are more people who are concerned about that and want to have reasonable conversations. What we need to do is to create a place for people who are like-minded in that degree to be able to communicate with each other. That's what I think is the way to move forward. And it's going to mean talking to some people that you're told you're not allowed to talk to if you're on the left right now.
Now, also, I know you've done some videos on this before, but maybe you could talk about your thoughts on how the woke intimidation on campuses, especially at Brett Weinstein and all that, is reminiscent of an inquisition.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I think I would go back just a little further. I believe it was Robin DiAngelo who's the one who wrote it, but I shared a video with you that is called "Logic is Whiteness," and it's got a picture of like a Simpsons quote of like a religious figure saying blasphemy, because they've kind of identified logic and rational thinking as like witchcraft / whiteness. Um, Basically, there was this flyer that was put up on the African American Smithsonian African American History Museum called, aspects of whiteness and white culture. And among the things that were on the list was emphasis on a scientific method, rational, critical, linear thinking, and there's a pushback going on right now trying to say that there is no objective truth. And if you do this, if you engage in this, then you're being white, and whiteness, of course, is this evil force. And the reason they don't just say only white people now is that they've run into some snags because there are black people who don't agree with them too. So they write scientific papers, and I wish I was making this up. I did videos reading some of them, and I had to pay to read some of them, where they're equating whiteness to being a parasitic uh, psychological condition that they think they're going to be able to treat. Like you'll be able to go to your psychologist to help you with your whiteness. And the reason they need it to be identified that way is so that they can explain people who don't agree with them, who are people of color. Well, they have internalized whiteness. As far as how it functions like an inquisition, we come back to this one quote that comes from Benjamin Boyce's documentary on what happened at Evergreen, the complete Evergreen story, which I highly recommend that everybody watch. It's long, but it's in like 22 parts that are small segments. So you can take it, like 10, 12 minutes at a time. But I do advise everybody to watch it from the beginning to the end because he's very, very thorough in showing how this kind of radicalization takes place on a college campus. But there's one moment in particular that I don't think gets enough airplay. And that's why I made the Logic is Whiteness video, to specifically isolate this issue, which is that there's a moment when the angry students who've been convinced that he's a witch, I mean racist, are going after him, and there's nothing logical about anything that they're saying. And eventually he gets away from the mob for a little bit, and he's just talking to a couple of students, and he's starting to make some headway. So of course, the inquisitors, one of them notices that and walks over there and like has to confront him. And at one point he literally spits out, "You have to stop demanding that people use logic and reason and white forms of information." And that's when it clicked into my head, because of course everybody tried to say that what was on that flyer that was on the museum, website wasn't really meaning that logic and reason were bad. It just meant that was an emphasis of white culture. That's how they tried to defend it. But the fact is that's not how it's being taught. It is being taught that logic and reason are bad. And that if you're using it, you're using white forms of information. And the chilling aspect of that I think, is the reason why I don't feel that people get it enough, is that if that's our stance, that because they equate all of this together, I might add, the communists who are part of that group equate whiteness with capitalism. So if you can label all that stuff in your enemy list, and you can say that all of these things are working together, then you can try to get people just to reject the idea of rational or critical thought altogether. And if you couple that with the need to say, well, my feelings are more important, that we need to respect your feelings. That's one of the aspects, for example, about critical race theory and the anti-racism movement, is that one of the things that they will put in their documentation is that you must believe the lived experiences of all people of color. But if you try to quote, say, things like my childhood, then they'll say, well, that's anecdotal, but they want the lived experiences of people in the oppressed boxes to be treated with the same weight as empirical data. And, as if it's infallible. When it comes to how it goes down as far as it being an inquisition, is that they need to find enemies to get everybody against. And when you watch the Brett Weinstein situation happen in that documentary, it gets very chilling. And that's when I started having comparisons to like the movie The Crucible, which is about the Salem witch trials. It gets so out of control, that they're micro analyzing every single thing that every white male does around them, to the point, like, for example, the president of the school was being told that his hand movements while he was talking were microaggressions. And eventually, by the time they're done with this guy, he's just standing there with his hands in his pockets so that he doesn't offend anybody. Then he gets told, no, that's offensive too. Like there is no correct answer aside from total subservience and obedience. And if that's the case, this is why George Orwell put in his own works, and George Orwell was a socialist. George Orwell said, if you're getting to the point that you're trying to eliminate objective truth, that is a very glaring warning sign that something authoritarian is on its way.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say a perfect example of how the contemporary left-wing media space is not only just distorting your perspective, but just literally fabricating something out of whole cloth is the police issue and violence. So I watched your video with the Punisher support Antifa or BLM. And, last 2019, 1,000 people were killed by the police in violent altercations. And many of those were justifiable self-defense on the part of the police. And by eliminating the police, you pointed this out, and I've pointed this out in other contexts, the very thing the left has wanted to avoid forever, private security. I mean, Noam Chomsky famously said that private power is unchecked tyranny because it's unaccountable to democratic processes. But you're literally dissolving police chiefs, which can be voted on by the people, to be replaced by Blackwater.
Right. Well, and that's what anarcho-capitalists would want. And then it becomes a profit-motivated business. I think that largely what goes on, and I guess maybe it helps that I used to work at this gas station when I was in my early 20s. And because it was a 24-hour gas station, I was working at night, the cops would come in because there's long periods of time where there's just nothing going on. And I would just talk to these guys for hours. And that humanized them to me. Like, I began to understand how they think. The abolish police and defund the police movements I have a nickname for. I call them dehumanize the police, because many of the people that are talking about this stuff have no idea what policing even looks like. They want to, make radical changes and talk about reform. I agree that there should be reform. Police officers will tell you they agree that there should be reform. I was the one that was often sent to talk to the cops during Occupy Detroit, and there were several cops who, actually completely supported us. They had to do what they were told to, to some degree. We're not allowed to go around smashing stuff, which I might add was generally done by Antifa in the presence of Occupy, and then we would get blamed for it. But first of all, they don't understand policing at all. Secondly, they don't understand crime. I have a friend who's an African-American gentleman, and he and I befriended each other on Facebook because of the fact that he saw white people telling me that I needed to stop talking because I was white and therefore was not qualified to talk. And he actually said, actually, no, you're all white. I'm black. You shut up. That's like how he put it. But, I asked him, I'm like, so we were just discussing things because he started watching my videos. And I said, well, you go to these protests, right? He's like, yeah, I go. And I just kind of try to quietly listen and get my view on things. But they're willing to say a lot of stuff in front of me because I'm black that they wouldn't say in front of you. I'm like, well, yeah, that's valid. And I said, so what kind of people do you run into? He's like, well, generally like two different groups as far as the abolish police crowd. And I'm like, okay, what are they? It's like, first, kids who are really naive about crime. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. I think his words were exactly, they think they know the hood because they drove through my neighborhood once, maybe to go to a nightclub or a rock concert. He's like, they've never been shot at. They've never been mugged. They've never been attacked by a gang. Like, they don't understand the power dynamics of my community at all. And this guy in particular had lost no less than two family members to gang violence, not to police. Anyway, and I said, well, what's the other group? And he said, well, criminals. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, as in people I grew up with who I know are lifelong criminals who are at these rallies. And then he made the point. He's like, has it ever occurred to you that during your Kyle Rittenhouse documentary that it's interesting that of the 4 people that Kyle interacted with, all of them were criminals? Every one of them, And so like the first guy that Kyle Rittenhouse shot, literally forcibly raped 5 boys between the ages of 9 and 11 years old.
Yep.
Is that the guy you want as your neighbor during an anarchist, society? Of course he wants to abolish the police. And then the rest of them, like the guy who fired the first shot, Joshua Zeminski, had like a rap sheet that was so long I couldn't even include it all in the documentary because it's like 7 pages long. I'd be talking about that guy for a half hour. And he was definitely right. It's like, there's like a lot of these people, their aspect on it is that they're criminals and they're thinking to themselves how much easier their lives will be if there's no cops around. And so the point is that you get really naive people who don't really understand crime, or you get people who have a vested interest in seeing committing crime being easier. And he said that tends to be the two primary groups. In what I've encountered, like I was actually on like an Antifa Facebook group that was meant to be secret, and I slid in there, and then they made the comment, they were having problems with it. They're like, what do we deal with? How do we deal with these people that think that defund the police isn't working? And I made, just a couple of poignant questions. It didn't take long before I was banned because I was deviating from the narrative. This is another major problem the left has right now is they have completely lost the art of debate. It's all about like dogmatic ideology. And if you don't follow it, then you need to be censored, not reasoned with, not explained to, censored, but regardless, one of the really ideological Antifa people spoke up and said, because I said, okay, well, because one of them, she said, well, defunding isn't enough anyway. We need full abolishment. And I'm like, okay, so what are you going to replace it with? And then she goes, well, nothing. We will defend our own communities, and our communist collective will eventually overcome all of people's needs, and all crime can be linked directly back to capitalism, and et cetera, et cetera. So I started kind of pointing out some clear issues. And one of the major points that she had was that, and it wouldn't be any hierarchical, situation where we have any authority. And I'm like, okay. So then I asked her a couple more questions. Like, so what are you guys going to do when, say, the Mexican drug cartel that operates in a country that is already has defunded police and, basically a government that's more or less completely owned through fear by the cartel? They're not going to show up, and just take your shit. They're going to go after you. Like they're not going to play around. And she's like, well, we'll defend ourselves. Do you think us Antifa militants are just going to stand down? And I'm like, okay, but fighting the cartel is not going to be like standing across from cops who've been ordered not to shoot you and throwing bottles at them and cussing at them. It's not going to look anything like that. And they basically just they refuse to acknowledge the reality of that. They don't
just to interject real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you ever read the Anarcho comic strip by Red and Black Salamander?
I don't think so.
Oh, it's hilarious. I won't show you everything, but basically he says, what if modern day Black Bloc Antifa were in Spain 1936? And he was just parodying everything that was going on. One incident was, we're getting attacked by the fascists, and they say, hold on, all of our troops are being sent to investigate a transphobic statement.
That's actually really good.
So yeah, because basically I brought that up because when this Antifa person you were talking to says, are we just going to stand down? If you read that comic strip, it shows you just how ridiculous the Black Bloc is compared to actual anarchist militants.
Well, right. And that was one of the final points I made. I said, because you said you're not going to have any hierarchy, meaning the person I'm talking to. I'm like, do you remember what got all the anarcho-communists killed in Spain? Because Orwell commented on that too. They didn't have any organization. If you're so hyper obsessed with not ever taking orders from anybody, when another group shows up that is taking orders, you're going to get killed. Militaries have command structures, not just for the purpose of like personal gratification. They have command structures because combat is something that has to be organized or you're going to die. Simple. I mean, I don't care if maybe you have some kind of consensus decision-making on picking how your command structure works or whatever, but you have to have a command structure. And they tend to try to fashion themselves in their delusions that they are the same thing, as these people. Like I remember once one of them was comparing themselves to the Viet Cong, and I'm like, you guys need a safe space if somebody drew Trump 2024 in chalk on your sidewalk and you think you're the Viet Cong. Like, I was like, do you have any clue what those people went through? Because I studied the Vietnam War very closely. I actually have military manuals on guerrilla warfare that were written specifically in response to the Vietnam War. Are you going to live on a handful of rice for a day? And do you think that you're just going to be able to get up and say, well, I don't like you being patriarchal in your way that you gave me that order. We want you removed. No, you would die. The Viet Cong would execute people who didn't take orders. They don't have any semblance of reality with all this. And it's unfortunate because there are valid ways of talking about trying to restructure the way policing work. There are valid arguments to be made, for example, about the connection between poverty and crime. But we can't even talk about any of that if we're bogged down, saddled with this kind of crap, which is what we are. That's the unfortunate thing is that, one of the things that growing up in those neighborhoods taught me, and I actually just had a guest on who's a preacher who lives in Chicago, one of the most, violent areas in the country. And he agreed with everything I just said. He's an African-American preacher. He thinks the riots are ridiculous. He thinks the violence doesn't help at all. And I pointed out to him, for example, that Black Lives Matter is sitting on millions, and his organization that does things like help kids get into the trades, like make sure that kids have a safe place to get better with their schoolwork, gets them jobs. That organization is never going to get anywhere near as much money as an organization that's just screaming abolish the police. They don't even have an understanding of what they're talking about. And while what this guy is doing essentially is what they claim they want to do by defunding the police, he will openly tell you that alone is not going to solve the problem. There's another element to this that people don't want to discuss. And there's a moment, I would say, that unfortunately is quintessential to this that you have to watch Ben Shapiro to watch. But there's a moment where he's debating two Black Lives Matter activists. And they say, how can we say that racism is not the cause of major income inequality, et cetera? And he said, because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And so they start laughing at him like that's the most ridiculous thing they've ever heard. And so he just breaks it down and he starts throwing statistics at them. And they get really quiet and awkward because everything that just came out of Ben Shapiro's mouth about, the high divorce rates, the teen pregnancies, the not finishing school, that's all true. And anybody who's ever lived there will tell you that that's true. And they didn't have a retort for that because, that would actually revolve, around like some actual self-introspection. So when crazy conservatives tell you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't have boots, yes, that's invalid. But you also could throw plenty of money into the ghetto if you don't have an actual like system or plan involved with how you're going to change the actual culture. And note I said culture, not race, because when I grew up there, the white, Hispanic, Asian kid, a lot of them got sucked into the seductive world of the gangs and the violence. It's not a racial issue. It gets associated as one, but it's a cultural issue. But if you can't address that culture, like I would get jumped for using big words in that culture, like just having a vocabulary, and that's not like my assessment of why. They literally said that to the school principal when they were defending themselves. He was using big words. I knew kids who had to hide their report cards because if they found out you had good grades, it was something you'd get bullied over. And, this is a culture that does things like, you're concerned about shootings and they say, well, we'll just decriminalize drugs. I'm like, well, that would certainly help. But you're also talking about a culture that believes it's the acceptable response if somebody disses you, I put in quotes, which is just street slang for disrespects you, that it's acceptable if you just to drive up and shoot them in their lawn. What are you going to do about that part? Are you going to address that? And nobody wants to talk about that. There's no activism towards that. There's no, like, I remember going back to the 80s, there was a show called, I want to call it Rock, but it was a sitcom, about a black family. And there was a moment where a drug dealer moves into their neighborhood. So he gets the neighborhood together to do activism and protest to get this drug dealer out of the neighborhood. I was like, well, this is brilliant, but you can't even talk about that now. Instead, what we would be doing is going out to protest that a cop shot a criminal in our neighborhood. We would put that together. That's the energy that would be together now. And it doesn't work. It's not just about morality. It doesn't work. It doesn't help.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you've done a video on this, but what is your thought on the January 6th incident?
I think that part of the problem with my analysis of the January 6th incident, and I watched crazy amounts of footage because I did a whole documentary about that too. It's about an hour long that I call "Hindsight is Always 2020." Insurrection, hindsight is always 2020, and I compare the January 6th riots to the 2020 riots. There's two major problems. One of them is that, first of all, the suggestion that January 6th was the evidence that they needed of a massive white supremacist threat in the United States. But black people took part in January 6th. Like the Blacks for Trump, like there's actually a video clip of that got put on, I want to say, the Washington Post's incredibly biased documentary about what took place. Is there's a moment where a black guy gets knocked out by the cops when they're in that tunnel fight. And all of his like colleagues there, probably people who've never known him, took very special care to pick him up and lift him out and make sure that he was safe. And they were all white. So if this is like actually a big neo-Nazi uprising, which is what they want it to be, that would have never taken place. They would have stepped over that guy to get to the cops. There's other pictures and energies of, not energies, I'm sorry, pictures and elements of this, of different black people, involved with that. Hispanic people also. I know a lot of Hispanic people that were Trump supporters. But do I support what happened? Of course not. Duh. But there's so much lying that goes on about it. And the fact that the other reason it's hard to talk about it is that we just tried to ignore 562 riots that went on in 2020 alone. They always say, well, this is a funny thing. They'll quote that statistic to you. Well, it says that like 92% of these that these protests were peaceful. I'm like, yeah, but there's another statistic that shows that 94% of the riots involve Black Lives Matter. Like, that's the other statistic. When it did happen, most of the time, it was because of an involvement with Black Lives Matter. And no, not all members of Black Lives Matter support that stuff. But what they do is they're either apologists for it or they're silent about it. They don't clean house. They make no effort to try to distance themselves from it. That's what's different about BLM versus Occupy. When we were in Occupy, when Antifa would run around and bust stuff, we would make public statements to the press that is not us. We don't approve of it. We don't want to be associated with it. That's not what we're about. Okay. But instead, what goes on now is that people try to justify it or suggest that this is the right way, this is the better way. And what's really ironic about this is that if you're concerned about the economy in your community, rioting is a perfect way to increase poverty. The LA riots from Rodney King, like way back in the 80s, LA is still not recovered from that. And they lost billions overall, not just in property damage. But what happens is people don't want to invest in your community if you do that. That's what the Chicago preacher I was talking about, Mr. Corey Brooks, said. And he, that's actually how I discovered him, is he said that in another documentary. He's like, you do that, and I can't get people to open businesses here. If they can't open businesses here because you guys reserve the right to riot anytime you don't like something the cops did, and you reserve the right to destroy the property of people who had nothing to do with the police shootings, nobody's going to want to build there. Why would they? And there's hard data about this where they compared the LA riots to the Miami hurricane destruction. Miami recovered. The LA has not. And it seems like their strategy is that if you're not willing to invest in our communities, then it's white flight or it's racism. It's not that we continue to maintain to reserve the right to burn down the community anytime we want. It's racism. And no sensible person of any color is going to want to invest in a community that think that's okay. Mm-hmm. As far as to go back to January 6th, so I know I didn't really address that enough, was that, first of all, there's so many asinine, ridiculous claims that are being made. They're like, we were this close to losing our democracy. I'm like, what do you think would have happened? Let's go scorched earth. Let's go absolute worst case scenario. Let's say they caught, say, Nancy Pelosi, and everybody that was in that building before they were evacuated. And we'll just say they executed every last one of them. Then the government changes. That suddenly the military goes, oh, I guess you guy there with the Viking helmet, I guess you're in charge now. We're just going to do whatever you say. The cops are going to do that. The rest of the government's going to do that. The Pentagon's going to do that. No, there was never any threat that the government would be taken over. And if that was really their intent, why is it that 0 of them were armed? That would have had to have been the most ridiculously poorly executed coup in the history of mankind. But it doesn't mean I support what happened. I don't. Okay. But there were other lies about it. Like if there were situations where, for example, they could push their anti-police narrative, they say, well, the police just let them in. So I literally, during my documentary, I played a video of the tunnel battle. This is what I call it, because it looks like a medieval siege, where just for the video I got, 45 minutes, and I didn't include all of it in the documentary, 45 minutes of cops literally clubbing people who are clubbing them back, shooting bear spray at people who are shooting bear spray back for 45 minutes in a tunnel, just going at it. The truth is that the cops in some places were vastly overwhelmed, and they could either choose to get stomped to death or let them in. And then in some places, the cops had more numbers and had their equipment and could do something about it. So the narrative that the police just let them in is just absurd. It's not even remotely true. But that just like the whole Kyle Rittenhouse supposedly shot into the crowd is another popular fiction. If they can find ways to make the cops look bad, then they'll do it, even if it just doesn't make any rational sense. The other element to it is just this notion. So, we've been over the white supremacist thing and that's silly. It's not Nazis. It's not fascists. The funny thing is that what these people believed was that their election was being stolen from them. Now, were they correct in that assessment? I have different thoughts about election fraud that we can talk about separately if you like, that don't have anything to do with any of Trump's claims. But if that's what you believe, and that's your motivating factor, then that's what you're going to go do. You're going to go fight because you think that your country's at that point is actually being taken over because people are, rigging the election system. That was their motive. That's the motive that nobody wants anybody to talk about. That's the motive that they don't want any characterization of, to be given to these people, that they might have had any kind of legitimate grievance, even if they were incorrect in their information. If the election was actually stolen, and they knew so infallibly, even a rational person would be like, well, what the hell do I do? We can't just let this happen. So, but they need it instead to be the boogeyman that can be their one thing, because they focus endlessly on that date as if that's the only riot that took place in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And if you go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, election fraud is a good question. But one of the things that made me concerned was looking back at the Democratic primaries in 2020, Bernie Sanders was clearly the favored candidate to win. And then all of a sudden, Biden started sweeping through, and I think began in Nevada. And I think there was some irregularities reported with the automated vote counting machines.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can talk about that for sure. It's unfortunate because I actually had the guy on my show twice. His name is Clint Curtis. He actually testified before Congress because his company was asked to write the software that rigs elections. And he testified before Congress to this end. And there were old documentaries that were ironically put out by left-leaning people that you can still watch. One of them for free, which I believe is like, I think it's like Murder, Spies, and Voting Lies, which I can give you links for it if you want it. But where he got interviewed. And I brought him on my show. Ironically, he's a progressive leftist guy running for Congress. So it's not like he's a Trumper, but he was working for the software company that got asked to do that. And he also got asked to write programs to make gerrymandering easier. And he testified, nobody refuted him. There were some people within his company that tried to discredit him because it made them look bad. The other thing is that there was a mysterious murder that happened with somebody associated with that. And, he had a guy who was one of his former coworkers because he left that company. And for a while he was working at a dollar store while he was working on, becoming a lawyer because he changed professions. And this guy kept coming in and asking him questions. And he's like, this is not really safe. These are not nice people. You should probably do this differently. And the guy wouldn't listen. And so the guy ends up, turns up, quote unquote, suicided in Georgia, and they lived in Florida. The reason this is relevant is that in order for this guy to drive all the way to Georgia and kill himself, we're talking about like a 3-hour drive to some random hotel out in the middle of nowhere in Georgia. The reason that's relevant is that they don't do autopsies automatically on suicides in Georgia. They do in Florida. If he had killed himself in Florida where he lived, then an autopsy would have been done. So you guys can go down that rabbit hole yourself. I don't want to sound like a tinfoil hat, but they've got plenty of evidence about this, including pictures of the guy's body that were later released after supposedly being lost and then finally being found, where it's very clear this guy didn't kill himself.
That sounds kind of like he got Arkansas-ed.
Well, right. No, and then that's exactly what Clint thinks. But it's the thing, he basically, before he died, he came to Clint and he was all excited. And he's like, I finally got to it. It goes all the way to the top. I'm going to expose it. You're going to be so happy. And Clint was like, you need to talk to somebody right now because this is not good. You don't understand how much danger you're putting yourself in. Clint fought that by writing a book and by testifying before Congress. At that time, he was, very public. It would have been dangerous to off him. But somebody, because that's the other thing, that the reason why Republicans, unfortunately, it's going to be some self-introspection on their part, because two things that I would say that are relevant, and I did videos about this because there was a group called TDMS Research that was keeping track of the exit poll information and the deviances between the exit polls and then the actual reported voting counts. I mean, even when we're dealing with that stupid app for the caucuses, that was like threw up red flags, talking about, like, I want to say Iowa, where Bernie won but then didn't win, and then they reported him as losing, even though they finally did eventually realize, no, he had more votes, and all those shenanigans. When you get to Super Tuesday, one of the other things that was going on at that time was that George Bush and Dick Cheney and his administration came out in support of Biden over Trump. And the first thing that's going through my head at this point is, so what are they getting out of this? And what do those people usually want? Well, they're all neoconservatives. They probably want wars. They're getting some kind of foreign policy agreement out of this, is my guess. But the reason I bring up Bush and them is that the technology that Clint Curtis took part in writing was used in the Bush-Gore and Bush-Kerry elections. There were all kinds of weird irregularities in both of those elections that had to do with voting machines. And, as Clint pointed out, he's like, and TDMS Research pointed this out too. We are actually one of the only major countries on the planet that still uses those things. Because it's, because Clint got called to become a consultant to other countries. How can you help us with our election integrity? And he said, period, you can't use a computer at all. He's like, it took me 5 lines of code to rig those machines. It's not even hard. The only way is publicly visible, hand-counted ballots. That's it. And that's why he also pointed out, he's like, if you're getting obsessed with fake ballots and, like people voting twice, he's like, you don't understand that it's not even there. That's all like a distraction. He's like, the problem is in your computers. And it's so subtle and it's so hard to find because, like he said, he's like 5 lines of code out of hundreds of lines of code. That's why when he testified before Congress, he said you'd never see it. And unless you went through every line of code, you're not going to see it. Because you just drop, like, it doesn't even take very much. Because it's a simple machine. I mean, all it does is count votes. So ironically, in its simplicity, that means it's simple to mess with it. And there were all kinds of documentaries that were done about this and election fraud back then that nobody talks about. And if now you bring up election fraud, you must be a Trumper. That's why I think it's unfortunate that it went this way, because now I have to dig myself out from all of that if I want to discuss that. And I interviewed him. He's still available, still running for Congress. Still tell you the same thing. I wish I could get him a bigger audience. He needs to be on like Joe Rogan or something explaining this, because he's a leftist and he acknowledges that this is an issue and he wants to deal with it, which is why he's running for Congress. And ironically, there's always erroneous things that happen, with his elections too.
Well, yeah. And what's interesting is just the fact that because we do live in this rage bait, and that's partly due to social media. But this idea that the trust is so low that you have to like sort of take a position that seems to be on the other side, even if it isn't. You're just trying to be principled, but then it makes your side angry. And yeah, a lot of people, like you said, have left the left. At least that's what they think they have to do. But I think part of it's also that they're tired of dealing with that element.
Well, right, because if you have a bunch of irrational behavior going on, then people are going to start questioning, well, what else are you being irrational about? What about your arguments about healthcare? Were you being irrational about that? Were you lying to me about that? I still don't agree with it, and I'll never do it. But I think that really what it's going to come down to, and this is kind of what I've done, is like, we have to just say, no, I will not comply, period. I'm not going to give up my logic and reason, and no, it's not going to happen. And what you are saying is wrong. And you have to insist on telling them that. You have to not be afraid of it. And it's unfortunate because there are very real consequences that can happen to you. But it's going to take enough of us, ironically, protesting essentially against ourselves to solve this problem. Because at the end of the day, ironically, this is all undoing the good work that was done by people like, say, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was actually starting to get even my Republican associates to be willing to at least talk about healthcare, to be able to talk about, UBI. Bernie's not solely responsible for that, but I would say at least they were open to the idea. And now that's not the left anymore. The left is not Bernie talking about Denmark. The left is Antifa beating up female journalists and spraying them and hosing them down with paint. The left is burning down cities. And the left is this, the left is that. And ironically, also from the anarchist perspective, and this is one comment that I made on that anarchist forum that actually got several likes and nobody answered me. They were like, do you think we'll ever succeed in what we're trying to do? And I said, well, let me tell you this. I don't think that going around destroying people's property and beating them up for disagreeing with you is a solid strategy to try to get people to agree with you on the idea that we don't need a state and we don't need police. I think, in fact, that's the most dumbass strategy you could ever have. You're going to try to convince me, no, don't worry, you don't need police, but we reserve the right to come beat you up if you said something we didn't like on Twitter. No, it's so completely actually backwards, and ironically now, more and more leftists are finally turning on them. Like Matt Taibbi, I'm going to say his name wrong.
Taibbi, right?
Yeah, he just recently wrote a piece calling out Antifa. And then this other longtime leftist, whose name unfortunately I'm forgetting, he also just wrote a piece calling out Antifa. Chris Hedges
also, I think Jimmy Dore and Glenn Greenwald as well, right?
I don't know if they did. I didn't watch that because I don't watch Jimmy Dore as much as I used to. I have some issues with him that we can talk about if you want. But the point is that more and more people on the left are finally getting sick of it. They're finally just saying, look, this is dumb. Bill Maher is probably the most public of them, but I wouldn't call him a prominent leftist because he wanted to vote for Hillary. But it doesn't change the fact that people on the left are just finally getting sick of this stuff. And it's going to take us creating, I guess I would call a home base or a platform, so to speak, for people who think like that, so that we can unify, so that these people don't feel so isolated. One of the things that I forgot to mention this when I was explaining what I do. So, are you familiar with the Ash Conformity Experiment?
I am not.
Okay, so I do a series on my channel called "Do You Think for Yourself?" With a question mark. And one of the first episodes, I talk about the Ash Conformity Experiment. Now, psychology, unfortunately, is full of a lot of BS right now because, and by BS, of course, I mean bad science. There's a lot of reproducibility problems. There's a lot of problems so far as obvious papers that are getting published that don't even have any data in them, that almost just read like opinion pieces. If you're familiar in any way, for example, with the Grievance studies affair, do you know what that is?
I'm not.
Okay, real quick. Basically, a group of activist scientists wrote fake papers and submitted them to journals for verification, and they included things like dog humping in dog parks proves rape culture and the patriarchy. In one of them, they took a chapter of Mein Kampf and rewrote it as a feminist piece, identifying male and men instead of Jew, and that got published. Like you can get all kinds of nonsense published in the social sciences as long as it ticks their boxes, you know. So anyway, the Ash Conformity Experiment. Yeah, that is James Lindsay's thing. I'm responding to your quote, your chat. The Ash Conformity Experiment was performed, I want to say, sometime during the 70s, but it is replicatable. If you get enough people together who don't know that that's what's happening, you can make this work. But basically, it works like this. So you're told, all right, here's the experiment. We're going to pretend that you're the guy. We want you to go into this room. There will be a group of people there. We're going to be doing a test to see, you know, how well people can observe, you know, lines on a wall. That's what you're told. You go in there and there's lines on the wall, and one of, like, you know, like they keep changing the slide. Okay, you know, here's the line we're looking at. Which of these other lines is the same length? And so you're sitting there and everybody's giving the wrong answer. You're like, what the hell? That's not the right answer. But then what they found was that most of the time, or actually a significant amount of the time, people will go along with it anyway because they don't want to be the odd man. And the more people you put in the room, the more this happens. The more likely somebody is to just go along with it, to say that the wrong line is the correct answer. And in the Ash Conformity Experiment, one of the other elements to this was that they found if that they gave you an ally, which is to say somebody who is also saying the actual correct answer, then more people are likely to go ahead and say the correct answer, if at least even one other person is doing that. So that's what I kind of feel my work is, you know, because right now there is so much pressure to tell people to just fall in line, you know, because that's the other thing about the Ash Conformity Experiment that it doesn't cover is now imagine that all of the other people in the room are going to tell you that you're racist if you don't say the same line as they are. What if you're sexist? What if you're misogynist? Or I call it the shotgun shell of oppression, because they'll throw all of these labels at you and just see what sticks. You know, you're racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, you know, transphobic, white supremacist. You're like the whole thing that'll just go down the line. You know, so my role is to be that guy who's the other person in the room who says, no, it's actually line number 2. It's not line number 3. You know, and that is a replicatable study. Psychology students will actually redo that study as like part of their, basically, you know, just like something they could do as far as to get credit. Like it's one of the studies that is you could replicate it. The point is that effect goes on and is going on now. And it kind of explains a lot about how mobs, you know, do things. And it goes back to, I would put it as a primitive instinct in our subconscious, because there was a time when if you were isolated from the tribe or the pack, it was probably going to get you killed. Like there's a reason why, for example, lone wolves do exist in nature, but their lifespan is considerably shorter. They're in, not just from the perspective of they just die because of rejection, they die because it's more dangerous. And so while that is not as true in our society now, this is still a fear that pops into the heads of people when a certain group of people are doing things. And this is an effect that people are aware of to some extent. And I say that there are layers to this. So the first layer is generally occupied by people who, and I don't say this to be cruel, but people who perhaps are not bright enough to grasp that these group dynamics exist. So they just go along with the group because they maybe are not even able to be conscious that anybody could be manipulated in this way. I throw in the same part of this group the people who have too much social anxiety to fight it. So they're aware of it, but they won't ever dare say anything about it because their social anxiety instinct is so developed that the fear of rejection in the group is so powerful that they can't overcome it. The next layer of people are the kind of people who maybe see you get into a fiery argument on Facebook and they don't even comment in the thread, but they send you a private message. And they say, geez, man, I'm so glad you did that. I'm so glad you made that argument. I totally agree with you, but they're never going to comment. They're not going to get involved. But you still did a service because you were the guy in the room during the Ash Conformity Experiment who got that guy to rethink his position. And then the final layer is occupied generally by tyrants and by revolutionaries who have a habit of getting killed. People like, say, William Wallace or Crazy Horse, who ironically have a lot in common. They both were thumbing their noses up at authority, and they were both right, and they were both freedom fighters. Anyway, but this layer is A, people who are aware of this effect and are using it to their benefit, and B, people who say, no, not only am I not going to allow you to do that to me, I'm going to actively prevent you from doing it to anybody else. And those are the kinds of rare politicians, like, say, Senator Mike Gravel, perfect example. Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, those are the kinds of people that kind of like pierce through the lines. And maybe you don't agree with everything they say, but the point is that they're cognizant of this, and they want other people to also be cognizant of this. And the establishment absolutely hates people like that, which is why another thing that's in common between William Wallace and Crazy Horse is they were both betrayed and murdered by their own people. Not even by the opposition. It was by their own people, because it was more important to them that they continue their hierarchy than it was, for these people to win freedom for them. And these are all phenomenon that are common for all humans. And if we're aware of them, you can really help to regulate a lot of their effect. Like another one I brought up was the Milgram experiment. The Milgram experiment is also replicatable. And in that one, you're sitting in a room and you're being told, okay, you're going to read these questions, and there's another person in another room, and you're going to read questions to them. And if they give you the wrong answer, then you have to use this button, and you're going to shock them with electricity. And the more answers they get wrong, you have to keep turning up the electricity. So what they found in that one was that in many cases, people will go all the way to the top electricity if a person of authority is telling them to do it. And that study was important because you're trying to understand, well, how do Nazis go from being farm boys in Germany to being, putting people in ovens? And that's another effect that people could be pushed into that people are not conscious of. But if you're aware that this is an effect, that this is something that can happen to you, then it can help you. And I kind of feel like at this point, one of the reasons I spend so much time on this and the logical fallacies is that we are getting to a point where all information is going to be so untrustworthy that our only defense is self-defense for the mind. You're going to have to learn how to navigate this stuff yourself, especially when deep fakes happen, when we can just create video evidence for ourselves. This kind of stuff goes on all the time. Like, it's almost a full-time job, for example, to track Antifa's misinformation machine. Because, for example, in LA recently, they stabbed a guy in the chest, actually penetrated his heart. He's still in the hospital in critical condition. And it was happening during the course of a melee where Antifa was getting the crap beat out of them. So a guy pulls a pocket knife out and he knifes a guy. There's clear video of this. And so Chad Loader, who's one of their guys, one of their media guys, posts a picture of the guy because they're trying to find more information about him so they can dox him and, look for some ways to demonize him. And then they wrote this fictional story that the guy was trying to save his life because he was being attacked with a skateboard. There's a couple of things about the way this went down that are funny. First of all is the picture that they use shows only the guy with the knife and a guy with the skateboard. When you expand the picture, you see that there's an Antifa member also with a skateboard directly behind him who's also using his skateboard in the melee. And then I said, oh, well, if you're concerned about that, here's a clip of, I put together a montage of Los Angeles Antifa brutally beating people with skateboards. Not just kind of tapping them. One guy they literally laid out with a skateboard. But they're trying to, and the funny thing, it reminds me of the Jay Danielson, Michael Reinhold murder, because when I did my documentary about that, people were like, well, he was pointing bear mace at him. I'm like, okay, so let's go over this. Let's say that that's what happened. Do you want to suggest that is an acceptable escalation of violence that every time somebody is bear spraying somebody, that they then therefore have a right to shoot them? And then I played a montage of them just walking up and bear macing people for saying things they don't like. So every one of those people can shoot you now. But that's an example of what I'm getting at when I say that they just twist things all the time. And the right does this too. It's not that doesn't happen. It's not. It just so happens right now, as somebody who's ironically on the left is that just so happens right now, the left is doing it way more often and seems to have the backing of the mainstream media while they're doing it. You know, I don't know why. I think I have some theories, and it comes back to what I said earlier about how during Occupy, we were worried about the Patriot Act. We were worried that we were going to get labeled domestic terrorists. And what I'm watching is, because my kids are involved in wrestling, that for whatever reason, there's a lot of conservatives whose families are involved in wrestling. Don't know why. But anyway, who are moderate Republicans, maybe even people who didn't even want to vote for Trump, but just didn't have another Republican to vote for, who are now becoming more and more comfortable with the idea that, well, we need to just send out police and round these people up and run them off to camps. Like, they're getting more and more comfortable with that idea, that that should be what happens to political dissidents. And this is a gradual process to try to more or less convince society that that's the acceptable solution, that that's how we should handle it. And I hate to say it, I understand it. I know why people are thinking that way. The real problem is that nothing is even being done in the conventional sense to stop them. And, you know, because I had a guy on, or rather I was arguing with a guy once, and you can catch this conversation in one of my videos. I frequently make videos about online conversations, and the reason why is because I constantly get told, nobody says that. So I literally have to make evidence. I'm like, okay, well, here's some evidence for you. This is a guy who claims he's an Iraq war veteran and that he trains revolutionaries for Antifa, and that they are fighting the most mechanized and militarized police force in history and winning. And I went over reality with him. That's actually the guy who was comparing himself to like the Viet Cong. And I'm like, you're not fighting police. He's like, yes, we are. I'm like, okay, let's go down to the bottom scale. Like, you guys are not even close to the crap that Martin Luther King dealt with. And he wasn't even fighting them. He was just sitting there. They would kneel before the cops and get beaten up. That's what would happen back in the 60s. So we're not even talking about proactive use of batons. We're not even talking about water cannons. We're not even talking about dogs. And this is before we even get into microwave cannons, which were perfected, like, I think back in 2010. We're not even talking about sonic weapons. None of that stuff has even started to be used on you yet. You're not fighting police. You know, and he tried to say, well, I know what war looks like. I fought Al-Qaeda and I was in Fallujah. And I'm like, okay, so how often did Al-Qaeda line up across from you with plastic shields and batons and let you just sit there and throw objects at them and curse at them? Tell me how much time in Fallujah you spent fighting Al-Qaeda where that is what happened. And he just basically at that point, the ad hominem starts spewing from him, and he doesn't, because that's not defensible. You know, but
yeah. I would just say, though, we are kind of out of time. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. Is there anything you'd want to say before we wrap this up?
Well, then, hey, yeah, I'd like to talk to you again sometime. People can check out my website. It's v-radio.us. And there you'll find links to all my social media stuff. It's not a fancy website. It just, there you can find my Discord, my Telegram, my different ways to contact me, because YouTube keeps throttling me, and I frequently get messages from people, hey, I didn't get a notification about your last show. It's like, okay, well, the only way to be sure to get it is to like get on one of these other social medias, because I put all my content on there.
All right. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Price of Folly podcast, signing off.